The letter hit the floor of the barn before John Walker even realized his hand had gone slack. He had read it 3 times already, standing there in the golden dust of a September afternoon in 1878, and each time the words carved themselves deeper into some hollow place behind his ribs. His ranch foreman, Dale Pruitt, had brought it over from the post office in Caldwell, Kansas, that morning with a crooked grin and a knowing look that John had not appreciated one bit. The letter was from a woman named Maude Keene, responding to the advertisement that Dale had placed on John's behalf without John's knowledge or blessing, and it said, in a handwriting that was careful and deliberate and somehow heartbreaking in its precision, that she would be arriving on the Thursday stage from Wichita, and that she hoped the ranch was as honest as the advertisement had described because she did not have the money to go back if it was not. She did not have the money to go back. John had stood in the field behind the barn for an hour after reading that, watching the dry grass move in the Kansas wind, and it was his ranch hand Ezra who had finally found him there and asked what was wrong, and John had said, "Nothing," because how did a man explain the specific weight of responsibility that settled over him when he realized a woman had committed everything she had to a letter he had never written? The Thursday stage arrived in a cloud of dust and the smell of hot horses and leather, and John Walker stood apart from the small crowd that gathered at the edge of Caldwell's Main Street, hat in his hands, watching the passengers descend. There was an elderly couple, a man in a drummer's suit with 2 large cases, a young cowboy who looked barely old enough to shave, and then there was Maude Keene. She was not what he had expected, though he had not let himself form a clear expectation because that seemed like a road that led only to disappointment. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair pinned up under a practical gray bonnet that had seen better days, and she carried a single worn carpetbag in one hand and a second smaller bag over her shoulder. She stood on the step of the stage and looked out at the street with the expression of someone who has already made peace with whatever they are walking into, and that look hit John somewhere deep and unguarded. He watched her scan the crowd. He watched her eyes move from face to face. He watched her straighten her spine and lift her chin by a fraction, and he thought, "She is frightened, but she will not show it." And something in him recognized that quality the way a man recognizes familiar country in a place he has never been. He should have stepped forward. He knew that. Dale was watching him from across the street with an expression of open exasperation, mouthing words that John chose not to read. But John stayed where he was for one moment longer, hidden by the press of people and his own hesitation, and he said under his breath, so quietly that only the wind heard it, "She does not know I notice." He noticed everything. He noticed the way she shifted the carpetbag from her right hand to her left because her right shoulder was already aching from the long stage ride. He noticed the brief flash of uncertainty that crossed her face before she smoothed it away. He noticed that she had dressed carefully for this arrival, that the dress she wore was clean and pressed despite the journey, and that she had done this not to impress, but because she had some bedrock standard for herself that she would not compromise even at the edge of the unknown. He noticed that she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with ornamentation and everything to do with the specific quality of her attention, the way she looked at the street and the buildings and the people as if she were genuinely trying to understand the place, not merely survive it. Dale crossed the street before John could stop him, and John heard him introduce himself, heard him say that John Walker was here somewhere and would be along directly, and John finally pushed away from the wall he had been leaning against and crossed toward them with his hat still in his hands. "Miss Keene," he said. She turned and looked at him with those eyes, which were a shade of brown that was almost amber in the afternoon light, and she said, "Mr. Walker," in a voice that was composed and level, and then she waited. He was not a man given to speeches. He managed his cattle and his land and the 15 men who worked for him with a minimum of words and a maximum of intent, and his men respected him for it, but standing in front of Maude Keene in the dust of the Caldwell Main Street, he felt every word he owned dry up and blow away like chaff. "I need to tell you something," he said finally. Her chin came up again by that fraction. She was bracing herself. He saw it, and it cost him. "The advertisement was placed by my foreman without my knowledge," he said. "I am not going to pretend otherwise because you deserve the truth before you take another step toward anything I am involved in. Dale meant well, and the facts in the advertisement were accurate, but you wrote your letter to a man who did not know you were coming, and that is a debt I owe you to say plainly." The silence that followed was the longest of his recent life. Maude Keene looked at him steadily, and he could not read what was happening behind those amber eyes, and then she said, "How many cattle?" He blinked. "I beg your pardon. The advertisement said a prospering cattle ranch in Sumner County. How many head?" "Close to 800 at present count," he said, thrown entirely off his prepared script, which had been somewhat sparse to begin with. She nodded once as if filing this information in some internal ledger. "And the house, is it standing?" "It is standing," he said, with a bewildered edge to it. "Then we are ahead of the average," she said, and picked up her carpetbag. "I appreciate the honesty, Mr. Walker. It is noted. Now I would like to see this ranch." He stood there for a moment longer in the September heat, while Dale attempted to disguise his laughter as a cough behind his hat. And then John Walker did the only sensible thing a man in his position could do. He went and got the wagon. The drive out to the Walker Ranch took the better part of an hour, because the land in Sumner County was flat, and the distances were honest, and the road was more suggestion than fact in certain places. John drove, and Maude sat beside him with her bags between them and watched the Kansas grassland roll out in every direction under the enormous sky, and for long stretches neither of them spoke, which should have been uncomfortable and instead was something else entirely. "Where are you from?" he asked somewhere in the middle of it. "Ohio originally," she said. "Cincinnati. My father ran a dry goods store. He died 2 winters ago of pneumonia, and the store passed to his business partner, and I found myself in a situation that required a decision." She said it without self-pity, which he noticed. "Do you know anything about cattle?" he asked. "I know they are large and that their opinions are difficult to predict," she said. He almost smiled. It was a near thing, but it was real. "That is more accurate than most of my ranch hands would manage." She glanced at him sideways with a quick, cautious curiosity, as if she were revising some initial assessment. "The advertisement said you were 32. I am. And you have run this ranch since when?" "I bought it at 24, he said. "Worked for other men for 6 years before that and saved every dollar I earned. The land here was cheap because it was considered too exposed to the cattle trail for comfortable settlement, but I wanted land that cattle already knew, so it suited me." She considered this for a moment. "You are not a man who does things by accident," she said. "No," he agreed. "Then it seems strange that your foreman was able to place an advertisement for a wife without your knowledge." It was a direct observation, and she delivered it without accusation, which he respected more than if she had made it a confrontation. "Dale has a particular talent for acting before being asked," he said. "He also has a particular talent for being right about things, which makes him difficult to be properly angry at. He thought you needed a wife. He has thought so for 3 years. He has mentioned it with increasing frequency since the 3rd year. And what did you think?" He drove in silence for a moment because the honest answer required a certain amount of unpacking. "I thought I was managing," he said finally. "The ranch runs well. The men are reliable. The accounts are sound. I told myself that was enough." "But," she said, because she heard the thing behind the word. He looked out at the grass and the sky and the long horizon. "The house is quiet in a way that isn't peaceful," he said. "That is the best I can describe it." She did not respond immediately, and when she did her voice had shifted to something more unguarded. "I know exactly what you mean," she said. "The Walker Ranch came into view just as the sun began to tip toward the western horizon, and it was a good sight. The main house was solid and square, built with real lumber that John had hauled from Wichita at considerable expense, because he had wanted something that would last, not something that would blow away in the first hard wind. There was a large barn, 2 bunkhouses, a cookhouse, and the beginnings of a second corral that was still under construction. The cattle were visible in the middle distance, moving slowly in that deliberate, unhurried way of well-fed animals, and the whole thing had the look of a place that someone had cared for consistently and well. Maude stood beside the wagon and looked at it all in the horizontal evening light, and he watched her face for her reaction, which he told himself was only practical. "It is a good place," she said. "It is," he said, and was surprised by the pride that rose in his chest when she said it. She slept in the spare bedroom that first night, which was a proper room with a proper door and a quilt that John's mother had sent from Missouri, and in the morning she was up before him, which he discovered when he came into the kitchen to find coffee already made and Maude Keene standing at the window with a cup in both hands, watching the hands move toward the barn in the pale early light. "You did not have to do that," he said, meaning the coffee. "I was up," she said. "And I found the canister on the first try, so it seemed efficient." He poured himself a cup and stood at some distance, and they watched the morning begin, and it was the specific and complicated piece of 2 people who are very carefully not yet deciding what they are to each other. The situation had a formal quality to it by unspoken agreement. She was there under the terms of a mail-order arrangement that had begun without John's consent, and he was a man who had spent 8 years building something that was entirely his own, and was unaccustomed to the texture of another person's presence in his private space, and they moved around each other with a cautiousness that was respectful and sometimes almost painful in its delicacy. But things were happening beneath that caution. They both knew it, and neither of them said so, and the knowing and the not saying had its own peculiar electricity. On the 4th day, one of the calves got her leg caught in a gap in the old fence along the eastern pasture, and it was Maude who found her because Maude had taken to walking the property in the mornings with a systematic attention that John had not asked for and could not help but notice. She came back to the barn at a run, which he also had not asked for and which arrested every word in his head when he looked up from the harness he was mending, and saw her running toward him with her skirts lifted and her hair coming loose and her face set with purpose rather than panic. She told him quickly, clearly, and accurately. Direction, distance, the calf's approximate age, which side the leg was caught, what she had tried before coming to get him. He was already moving before she finished, and she was beside him, keeping pace, and when they reached the calf she held the animal's head with a confidence that surprised him while he worked the leg free with patient, careful hands. Afterward they stood and watched the calf trot back to her mother with that indignant, wobbly gait of young animals who have been frightened and are now pretending they were not. "You have been around livestock before," he said. "My uncle kept a small farm outside Cincinnati," she said. "I spent summers there when I was young. I was not useless." "I never thought you were," he said. She looked at him quickly, as if checking whether he meant it, and he met her eyes steadily so she could see that he did. That evening, after supper, which they took together at the kitchen table while the hands ate in the cookhouse, she asked him about his family. It was a careful question, asked with the tone of someone who is opening a door they are prepared to close quickly if the room on the other side is too much. He told her about his parents in Missouri, his father a minister, his mother a woman of extraordinary practical intelligence whose quilt was on the spare bed. He told her about his younger brother Thomas, who had gone to work on the railroad and had died of typhoid fever in 1873, and that telling was brief and even and cost him something that she could see in the set of his jaw, but he did not look away from it. She told him about her parents, about the dry goods store, about watching her mother manage accounts at the kitchen table every evening with a pencil worn down to a stub, about a younger sister named Clara who had married a farmer in Indiana and wrote letters on the first Sunday of every month without fail. "Do you miss her?" he asked. "Every day," she said, without hesitation or self-consciousness, and he thought that was one of the braver things he had heard. There was a man in town named Garrett Cole who John had known since coming to Sumner County, a land speculator with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having had to build anything from nothing. Cole had a habit of appearing in places where he was not strictly wanted, and he appeared at the Walker Ranch on the second Saturday after Maude's arrival with his good hat on, and a bottle of whiskey under his arm, and an expression of elaborately casual interest. He shook John's hand and clapped him on the shoulder, and his eyes went straight to Maude with an attention that was not subtle, and was not respectful in the way John meant the word. "Heard you had a lady come out from the east," Cole said, with the drawl he applied to all social transactions. "Word travels fast in a small county." "It does," John agreed. Cole introduced himself to Maude with a lot of charm, and very little of the specific attentiveness that distinguished real interest from performance. And John stood back and watched, and told himself he was simply being a host, and was not doing anything that could be reasonably characterized as watching for signs of reciprocal interest from Maude, even though he was doing exactly that. Maude was polite in the way a woman is polite when she has taken a measure of a person and found the number wanting. She answered his questions briefly and redirected each conversational gambit with a precision that was almost surgical, and Cole, who was accustomed to a warmer reception, began to look faintly puzzled. He left after an hour, and John, walking him to his horse, received a clap on the shoulder and the information that his new arrival was a fine-looking woman, which John chose not to respond to in any of the ways he wanted to. When he came back inside, Maude was washing the cups at the basin with an expression that suggested the visit had required some management. "He comes around often?" she asked. "More than is strictly necessary," John said. "He wants something," she said. It was not a question. "He generally does," John said. "Currently he wants the eastern pasture which borders his land. He has made an offer twice and been declined twice. I expect he will make it a third time before he accepts that the answer is fixed." She dried her hands on the towel and turned around and looked at him with that direct, amber gaze. "And the visits are about softening the position," she said. "That is my reading." "And today's visit was about something else he thinks might be persuaded," she said. He met her eyes. "I expect so." She held his gaze for a moment, and something moved in her expression that he could not quite name, and then she said, "He will be disappointed," and went back to her work. John Walker stood in his kitchen and felt the specific warmth of that statement spread through his chest like a coal brought back to life, and he was aware that he was in considerably more trouble than he had supposed. He had told himself during those first careful days that what he felt was simply the natural interest of a man in the situation of a man. He had told himself it was the specific quality of her intelligence, which was genuine and unsentimental, and drew him the way good water draws a thirsty animal. He had told himself that the fact that he found himself manufacturing reasons to be in whatever room she happened to be in was merely habitual, the normal adjustment of a man to a new presence in his space. He had been telling himself a great deal that was not strictly accurate. At night, lying in his room on the other side of the wall from the room where she slept, he thought about the way she had held the calf's head with those capable hands. He thought about the precise way she described things, without exaggeration in either direction. He thought about the morning she had laughed, really laughed, at something Ezra had said in passing, and the way the sound had come out of her unguarded and full, and how he had been standing across the yard and had heard it and had stood very still for a moment like a man who has suddenly understood the answer to something he has been working on for years. She did not know he noticed these things. He was certain of it because she went about her days with the focused, unself-conscious energy of someone who is genuinely engaged with what is in front of them rather than with how they appear to others. And it was one of the things that he found most compelling about her, and also one of the things that made the distance between them feel most acute, because she was not performing anything for him and he was not performing anything for her. And yet here they were, two honest people in the same house. getting further into something that neither of them had yet named. 3 weeks after her arrival, the situation named itself. It happened in the way that the most consequential things often happen, not with ceremony but with an ordinary moment that turns out to be extraordinary. They were mending the porch railing together in the early evening, the one on the south side of the house that had been on John's list for 2 months, and that Maude had simply begun working on one afternoon without discussion. He had come home from the eastern pasture to find her with a hammer and nails, and the focused expression she brought to everything that needed doing, and he had gone and gotten his own hammer and joined her without comment, which she had accepted without comment, and they had worked side by side in the cooling air until the railing was sound. She hit her thumb with the hammer. It was a solid hit, the kind that produces a specific quality of pain, and she made a short, sharp sound and stopped and pressed her thumb against her palm, and he was beside her before he had made a conscious decision to move. He took her hand in both of his and looked at the thumb, which was beginning to go red and would certainly bruise, and he held it with the same careful, even pressure he used when he was dealing with an animal in pain, which is to say with all the gentleness he possessed, and he said, "That is going to be sore tomorrow." "I am aware," she said, but her voice had gone quiet in a way he had not heard before. He looked up from her thumb and found her face very close and her eyes on him, with an expression that was open in a way she usually was not, and they were both very still for a moment with the sound of the grassland around them, and the evening light going gold and low across the flat Kansas land, and John Walker felt with absolute clarity the specific choice available to him. He could step back. He was good at stepping back. He had been stepping back from this particular edge for 3 weeks with considerable discipline, and it had not yet killed him. He said, "Maude," just her name, nothing attached to it. But it came out with everything he had been carrying in it, every morning with the coffee and every evening at the table and every small specific thing he had noticed and not said, and she heard it all. He could see that she heard it all, and her hand turned in his and held on. He kissed her carefully, the way he did everything that mattered with his full attention and nothing held back, and she kissed him back with a warmth and a sureness that undid several years of careful self-management in one instant, and when they separated he rested his forehead against hers and said, in a voice that did not entirely belong to him, "I have been watching you since the moment you stepped off that stage." She pulled back just enough to look at him. "I know," she said. He stared. "You knew." "I noticed," she said, and there was a smile in it that was small and warm and entirely hers. "I noticed things too, John." He made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else entirely, and she was laughing too, and he kissed her again, less carefully this time, and the half-mended porch railing stood as witness to the fact that something had shifted irrevocably in the quiet life of the Walker Ranch. The next morning came with its ordinary demands as mornings do regardless of what has happened in them, and John rode out with the hands to check on the herd, while Maude worked in the kitchen garden that she had begun expanding with a systematic attention that Ezra said was going to double the yield before winter. And it was ordinary, and it was different. And the specific quality of the different was something that John found himself thinking about on the back of his horse in the middle of several hundred acres of Kansas grassland, with a clarity that surprised him. He wanted to marry her. He had wanted to marry her for at least 10 of the 21 days she had been on the ranch, which was a fact he was willing to admit to himself with moderate difficulty, and he was aware that the wanting had very little to do with the formal arrangement that had brought her here and everything to do with the specific woman she was. But there was the matter of the arrangement, and it needed to be addressed honestly, because Maude Keene deserved to choose freely and not to find herself obligated by circumstance or debt, or the absence of alternatives. And John Walker had built his entire life on doing things in a way that he could look at directly, and he was not going to stop now. He came back from the range at midday and found her in the kitchen garden with her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back and mud on her hands, and he said, "Can I speak to you for a moment?" She straightened and looked at him and read something in his face, because she was very good at reading him. "That sounds serious," she said. He said. They sat on the south porch, the one with the newly mended railing, and he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that the honest answer is the only one I want, regardless of what it is." She waited. "You came here on terms that were not presented to you honestly from the start," he said. "You were told there was a man who had advertised, and the man existed, but he had not advertised, and that changes the nature of what you walked into. You have been here 3 weeks. You know the ranch. You know me as much as a person can know another person in 3 weeks, which is some but not everything. And I need to ask you whether you want to be here. Not whether you have a choice, but whether you want to." She was quiet for a moment. "You are asking whether I am staying out of necessity or out of choosing." "Yes," he said. She looked out at the land, at the grass and the sky and the long, flat horizon that was so different from anything she had grown up in, and when she looked back at him, her face was entirely open. "When I got on the stage in Wichita," she said, "I was frightened. I had $53 and a carpet bag and a letter from a man I had never met, and I was frightened in the way that a person is frightened when they are doing the right thing, and they cannot be certain it is the right thing. And when you told me on the first day that you had never written that advertisement, I thought, well, this is the moment you find out whether you made a terrible error." He waited. "You told me the truth," she said. "You told me the truth before you knew anything about me, before you knew whether I was worth telling the truth to, before you had any reason except that you are apparently made in such a way that you cannot do otherwise. And I thought, whatever else this is, it is real. And real is what I came for, even if I could not have said so in those words before I got here." He said, "That is not quite an answer to what I asked." She looked at him with a flash of something that was almost amusement. "I want to be here," she said. "Is that clear enough?" "It is," he said. "Good," she said. "Now I would like to finish the garden before the light goes." He watched her walk back into the garden with the sun behind her and the Kansas wind moving her skirt, and he felt something settle in him with the specific finality of something that has been a long time looking for its place. He asked her to marry him properly the following Saturday, at the kitchen table after supper, when the light was low and the ranch was quiet. And he did it without poetry because he was not a poet, but he did it with every word he had and the full weight of what he meant behind them. He told her that he wanted a life built with her, not simply near her. He told her that he had been alone a long time and had made his peace with it, or thought he had, until she arrived and showed him the difference between solitude and loneliness in a way he could not thereafter unknow. He told her that he believed she was the most honest and capable and quietly remarkable person he had encountered in 32 years of living, and he would like, with her consent and at her chosen timing, to be her husband. She looked at him across the table for a long moment with her hands folded around her coffee cup, and she said, "Yes, John, I would like that very much." Dale heard the news the next morning and went around the ranch for the rest of the day with the expression of a man who has been vindicated by history and intends to make the most of it. And the ranch hands produced a bottle from somewhere and made enough noise about it that John finally went out and told them all to get back to work, which they did, grinning. Garrett Cole heard about the engagement from the postmaster, which was how everything traveled in Sumner County, and he rode out to the ranch 3 days later with the bottle of whiskey again, and a smile that did not reach his eyes. And John met him at the gate with a courtesy that was perfectly calibrated and somewhat less warm than before. Cole offered his congratulations with elaborate goodwill, and then, while they stood by the corral, said almost as an aside that he had heard some things about Maude Keene that he felt, as a friend, that John ought to know. John looked at him. "I heard," Cole said, maintaining the easy tone, "that she left Wichita under some particular circumstances. That there was some trouble there, a situation with a former employer, something financial. I'm not saying the source is reliable. I am just saying that a man in your position, with everything you have built, cannot be too careful." John was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cattle in the field and the barn and the solid square house, and then he looked at Garrett Cole. "I am going to say this once," he said, "and you can do what you like with it. Whatever you heard and whoever you heard it from, the answer is the same. I know Maude Keene. I have watched her every day for 3 weeks, and I know what kind of person she is. Not because someone told me, but because she shows it in everything she does. If you have a genuine concern about something real, you bring it to me with evidence and I will hear it. If you are telling me a story to make me uncertain of a woman you would rather see unattached, then you are wasting my time and insulting us both, and I would prefer it if you did not do that." Cole's easy smile went very still for a moment, and then it came back thinner. "No offense intended," he said. "None taken," John said. "The offer on the eastern pasture is still declined." Cole rode away in a cloud of dust, and Dale, who had been pretending to work on the fence within earshot, straightened up and said, "Do you think he was making it up?" "I think he was making it up," John said. "What if he wasn't entirely?" John picked up his gloves. "Then Maude will tell me if she wants to in her own time, and that will be her right." That evening he did not mention Cole's visit to Maude. He told himself it was because there was nothing to tell, and this was mostly true, but it was also because he wanted to give her the space that Cole had tried to take away. He did not have to wait long. On a Tuesday evening 2 weeks before the wedding, she came and sat across from him after supper and said, "There is something I should tell you, and I want to tell you before someone else does, because I want you to have it from me." He put down his book and gave her his full attention. She told him that in Wichita, where she had been working as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant named Harlan, she had discovered that Harlan was falsifying his accounts to a business partner named Doyle, skimming from the books in a way that would eventually have ruined Doyle entirely. She had confronted Harlan, and he had first tried to bribe her to stay quiet, and then, when she refused, had dismissed her and spread a story around his particular circle of acquaintance that she had been let go for stealing. It was a lie, and she had known people who knew the truth, but the story had made her situation in Wichita untenable, and it had been part of what had driven her to answer the advertisement. She said all of this evenly, without dramatics, watching his face. He said, "Did Doyle ever find out?" She looked slightly surprised, as if she had been prepared for a different first question. "I wrote him a letter before I left," she said. "I told him what I had found." "I do not know whether he believed me," John nodded. "Did you keep any records of what you found in the accounts?" She reached into her skirt pocket and produced a folded paper which she laid on the table. "I made copies of the relevant pages before I was dismissed," she said. "I was not certain what use they would be, but it seemed important not to leave without them." He looked at her across the table. "You are the most organized person I have encountered," he said. She almost smiled. "Are you angry?" "About what?" he said honestly. "About the fact that you found a crime and refused to cover it up and lost your situation over it." "No, Maude, I am not angry." She let out a slow breath that told him she had been carrying this for some time. "Harlan has a wide acquaintance," she said. "The story follows me. I wanted you to know the truth of it." "I know the truth of it," he said. "I knew the truth of you before you told me the specifics." He paused. "Cole came out last week." He repeated something that sounded like it came from Harlan's version. Her face went still. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I knew what kind of person you are," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes went very bright, and she looked away quickly. And he let her have that moment and did not say anything more, because some things are better honored with silence than with words. They were married on the 14th of October, 1878, in the town of Caldwell, Kansas, by the circuit preacher on one of his regular visits through the county. It was a small wedding by design and by preference, which suited them both. Dale stood up with John, and Maude was attended by Mrs. Harding, the wife of the post office keeper, who had taken a swift and comprehensive liking to Maude on the basis of a conversation about garden irrigation that had apparently been very satisfying to both parties. Maude wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself, because there was no dressmaker in Caldwell capable of the work she wanted on the timeline available. And John wore his good jacket and his cleanest hat, and they stood in front of the preacher in the afternoon light of the small church, and said the words that bound them together with a seriousness and a warmth that made the preacher, who was accustomed to this ceremony in its many forms, say afterward to his wife that he had rarely performed a marriage that he felt more confident about. John looked at Maude through the whole of it with the full intensity of attention that he had been applying to her since the moment she stepped off the stage, and she looked back at him with her amber eyes clear and steady and unafraid. And when he said, "I will," he meant it in every direction that meaning could go. The ranch hands made noise again that evening, louder and longer this time, and Dale produced a fiddle from somewhere and played with more enthusiasm than accuracy. And there was dancing on the packed earth beside the barn, and it was the warmest and liveliest the Walker Ranch had ever been. And John held his wife in the October evening and danced with her to Dale's imprecise fiddle music and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the house would not be quiet in the wrong way anymore. Maude settled into the ranch with a thoroughness that was organic rather than effortful, which is to say she did not try to change the place so much as she grew into it the way a good plant grows into honest soil, and the changes she made were gradual and sensible, and the ranch hands adopted them mostly without noticing. The kitchen garden became a serious production. The account books, which John had kept accurately but without the specific elegance that Maude brought to organization, became a model of clarity. She began teaching herself the particulars of cattle management with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, asking questions of John and the hands in the evenings, and making notes in a small journal she kept on the kitchen shelf. John watched all of this with a quiet, private pleasure that he was only slowly learning to acknowledge without self-consciousness. He was not a man accustomed to being happy in a way that showed, and happiness of this particular texture, the happiness of a shared life with someone he respected and desired, and was continually surprised by, was new enough that it occasionally caught him off guard. Like the morning he came into the kitchen to find her singing under her breath while she worked, not a song he recognized, something she was apparently making up as she went, a running commentary on the state of the flour barrel and the necessity of ordering more from town, set to an improvised and cheerful tune, and she didn't hear him come in, and so she kept singing, and he stood in the doorway and listened and was aware, in a way that was now familiar and no less potent for being familiar, that this woman was the best thing that had ever come to him by accident. Winter came to the Kansas plains with its usual intent, and the ranch went into the productive hunkering down that characterized that season, the checking and mending and accounting and preparation that kept a cattle operation functioning through the cold months. John taught Maude to ride properly in the snow-dusted fields of November and December, and she took to it with a composure that he found both impressive and amusing, because she applied to riding the same analytical determination she applied to everything, and insisted on understanding the mechanics before she would commit to the performance, which made for some early sessions of considerable deliberateness before she settled into a fluid, confident seat that his horse approved of. In the long evenings they read to each other, which had started by accident when Maude found a novel in the small collection of books that John kept on the shelf beside the hearth and asked about it, and which became a habit that structured the winter evenings with a pleasure that was both the words themselves and the specific intimacy of one person's voice in the close warmth of a room with the wind outside. She told him more about Clara, her sister in Indiana, and he wrote to Clara on Maude's behalf because Maude's right hand was sore from mending, which was the given reason, though the actual reason was that it pleased him to do this for her. Clara wrote back in January with a letter full of warmth and curiosity, and the news that she was expecting her second child in the spring. Maude read the letter at the kitchen table and folded it very carefully, and then she said, "I want children." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "Is that something you want too?" she asked. It was the kind of direct question that he had come to understand was her way of avoiding the specific misery of assumptions left unverified. "Yes," he said. She nodded and refolded the letter and set it on the shelf, and that was the end of the conversation. But it was the beginning of something else. And in the late spring of 1879, Maude told him with a matter-of-fact directness that was all her own that she believed she was expecting. And John Walker, who had faced drought and financial loss, and the death of his brother and 800 cattle and Garrett Cole's continuing interest in his eastern pasture, stood in his kitchen and could not speak for nearly a full minute. "Are you all right?" she asked, with a look of slightly alarmed amusement. "Yes," he said, which was entirely inadequate, and so he crossed the kitchen and held her with a care and an intention that said everything he could not yet find the words for, and she held him back. And outside the Kansas spring was doing its enormous uncomplicated thing, the grass coming back, and the sky going its enormous blue, and the cattle moving through it all with their vast bovine serenity. Their son was born in December of 1879 at the Walker Ranch, with Mrs. Harding attending as midwife, a role she performed with considerable expertise. John paced the length of the south porch in the December cold, and did not pace it with any dignity or grace, but simply with the raw animal urgency of a man waiting for the two most important things in his world to be safe. When Mrs. Harding opened the door and told him to come in, his hands were shaking. Maude was tired and bright-eyed and looked at him from the bed with an expression that he would carry in his chest for the rest of his life, and the boy was small and red and entirely himself, which is the specifically astonishing quality of new people. And John sat on the edge of the bed and held his son and looked at his wife and felt something so vast and clean and uncontainable that language could not get adequate purchase on it. "Thomas," Maude said, because they had discussed names at length over many evenings, and because she had listened carefully when he talked about his brother and understood what the name would mean. He looked at her. His throat was tight. "Thomas Walker," she said softly, and reached out and touched his hand where he held the baby, and it was the most tender thing she had ever done, and he loved her so entirely in that moment that it seemed impossible a person could contain it and continue to go about the business of being a person. "Thank you," he said. It was not enough. It was everything he had. Thomas Walker grew in the manner of healthy children, with speed and noise and an increasingly complex array of opinions, and the ranch grew with him, because John made a second significant land purchase in 1880, expanding the eastern boundary and incidentally resolving the matter of Garrett Cole once, and for all when Cole, facing a difficult winter and some poorly considered investments, sold his adjacent property to a buyer who turned out to be a young family from Illinois who had no interest in speculation and considerable interest in growing wheat, and became pleasant neighbors who borrowed tools and lent them back. The matter of Harlan, the Wichita merchant, resolved itself at a distance and in Maude's favor. A letter arrived in the spring of 1880 from a man named Doyle, the business partner, who had found Maude's original letter and had eventually investigated and found the evidence sufficient to take legal action, and who wrote to inform her that the situation had been addressed, that Harlan had been confronted with the falsified accounts, that Doyle had involved the local law, and that he wanted her to know, wherever she was, that her honesty had saved him from a serious injury, and he was grateful. Maude read the letter twice and set it on the table beside Mrs. Harding's letter and Clara's letter in the collection of papers that mattered, and she said to John, "There, that is done." "I never thought it wasn't," he said. "I know," she said, "but it is good to have it done." He understood. The weight of unresolved things, even when you were certain of the truth of them, had its own particular gravity, and it was good to put it down. The summer of 1881 brought a drought that was serious but not fatal, and John managed it with the combination of foresight and flexibility that characterized his management of everything, rotating the herd, negotiating water rights, taking on extra feed at cost. Maude kept the accounts during this period with a rigor that identified 3 areas of expenditure where they could tighten without undermining the operation. And John implemented her recommendations and told her so directly, and the ranch came through the summer thin but sound. Dale, who had spent 4 years being vigorously certain that John needed a wife, spent the same 4 years being equally certain that what he himself needed was no such thing. And it was therefore a considerable event when he arrived at the house one September evening with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has been defeated by something he loves. To introduce a woman named Ruth who worked at the boarding house in Caldwell, and whom he had been seeing in secret for 6 months, because he had not wanted to be lectured. Maude took one look at Ruth and one look at Dale and said, "Sit down and have some coffee and stop looking like you are expecting punishment." And that was the end of that particular tension, and John shook Dale's hand with a warmth that expressed everything, and Dale's face did a complicated series of things before settling into relief. Ruth was a sensible woman with a dry sense of humor and very little patience for nonsense, which made her and Maude natural allies and made the Walker Ranch, when both couples were there together, a livelier place than it had been for most of its history. Dale married Ruth in Caldwell in October of 1881, and there was more noise and more fiddle music, and Thomas, who was nearly 2 years old, slept through most of it on John's shoulder with the magnificent indifference of the very young. Maude became pregnant again in the spring of 1882, and this time the pregnancy was harder in the early months, with a persistent nausea that she managed with the same pragmatic determination she brought to everything that was difficult but not catastrophic, though John noticed the effort behind the management and took on additional household tasks with a naturalness that she accepted without making it a point. Because they had long since established that help between them was not a ledger to be balanced, but simply what people who loved each other did. The second child arrived in November of 1882, a girl, small and serious-faced, with John's dark hair and Maude's amber eyes, and they named her Eleanor after Maude's mother. Eleanor Walker turned out to be a child of emphatic opinions and considerable vocal range, and Thomas, who was approaching 3 years old, regarded her with the mixed fascination and suspicion of someone who has been the sole occupant of a territory and is now asked to reconsider. The reconsideration took about 3 weeks, and then he decided she was acceptable, and after that he became her most dedicated defender, which continued for the rest of their shared childhood and beyond. John watched his children in the evenings, Thomas running in the yard with the unfocused energy of a very small person who has not yet understood that direction is useful, Eleanor in Maude's arms or his own with those wide, serious eyes taking in the world. And he thought about the barn floor and the letter that had fallen from his hand, and all the unlikely steps between that moment and this one. It was a story that could have gone wrong at any of a dozen points. Maude could have gotten back on the stage after the first day. He could have been a different kind of man. Harlan could have found a way to follow his story westward. The drought could have broken the ranch. Any of 10,000 contingencies could have altered the shape of what became their life, and none of them had, and the improbability of this was something John felt in his chest on the evenings when he sat on the south porch with Maude beside him and the Kansas dark coming on, and the stars beginning their enormous overhead business, and he was grateful with the specific totality of a man who understands exactly what he has. He told her so, on one of those evenings in the summer of 1883, in the direct way that was his manner, without ornament. He said that he wanted her to know, if she did not already know, that she had changed everything, and that everything she had changed was better than it had been, and that he was aware of this every day and did not want to be the kind of man who assumed she knew it without being told. She looked at him with those amber eyes that had been the first thing he had really seen about her, and she said, "I know, but I am glad you told me." "I will probably tell you again," he said. "I expect you will," she said, with the small warm smile that was entirely hers, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched the Kansas evening in the comfortable silence of two people who have nothing to prove to each other and everything to share. The ranch continued to grow, and the years of the early 1880s shaped themselves into the long, textured narrative of a life honestly lived. There were hard winters and good springs. There were years when the cattle market paid well, and one year when it did not, and they weathered it with the same deliberate cooperation that they brought to everything. There were illnesses, the children's usual parade of winter sicknesses, and one serious winter in 1884, when John himself was felled for 2 weeks by a lung infection that frightened Maude in a way she did not show while it was happening and admitted to afterward, sitting beside him while he recovered and telling him, with the same directness she brought to everything, that she did not care to repeat the experience, and that he was to take better care of himself, which was not optional. He promised, which he meant and largely kept. Thomas, by the age of 6, was already following John around the ranch with a concentration that was unmistakably inherited, watching how things were done, and asking questions with an insistence that John answered fully and patiently, because the questions were good. Eleanor, at 4, had decided that the horses were her particular domain, and spent considerable time in the barn making friends with them in a determined and methodical way that Ezra, who had looked after the horses since before Maude arrived, regarded with a mixture of amusement and respect. Maude had by this time become a significant figure in the broader Caldwell community in ways that had grown organically from her particular abilities and the specific gaps in what the community needed. She had begun helping the schoolteacher with reading instruction on Tuesday afternoons, when the teacher was stretched thin across the different age groups, which had turned into something more systematic when the schoolteacher left to marry a man in Wichita, and the school was temporarily without instruction, and Maude organized the older children to help with the younger ones while a replacement was found. And this had led to a standing arrangement where Maude's involvement with the school was a recognized and relied upon feature of how the town functioned. She had opinions about the education of children that were ahead of what was common practice in the county, and she expressed them in the practical, non-combative way she expressed everything, which meant that most of them were adopted without becoming controversies. She believed that children learned better when they understood why something was true rather than simply that it was true. And she believed that girls and boys were equally capable of any intellectual work and should be treated accordingly. And these beliefs were apparent in everything she did in the classroom, whether or not she stated them as principles. John was proud of her in the way that is not possessive but is genuinely expansive, the way you feel when something you love does something that confirms and exceeds every good thing you believed about it. He told her so. He told the hands so, with more restraint, but in ways that were clear. He was not a man who spoke grandly, but when he spoke about Maude, it had a quality that his men recognized and respected. In the fall of 1885, Maude told him she believed she was expecting again, and this time they both looked at each other across the kitchen table with the accumulated knowledge of 2 previous experiences and a shared delight that had not diminished with familiarity. "Are you pleased?" She asked because she still asked, and he still loved that she asked. "Entirely," he said. "It will be a lot with Thomas and Eleanor already," she said. "The ranch will be busy next spring." "It is always busy in the spring," he said. "We have managed every other spring." "We have," she agreed, and reached across the table and took his hand. And they sat like that in the warm kitchen while the Kansas autumn did its enormous work outside. And it was entirely ordinary and entirely the life they had made and entirely, in the most real sense of the word, enough. The third child was born in April of 1886, another boy, pink and loud, and they named him Samuel, because there had been a minister in Missouri named Samuel who had been kind to John's family when they needed it, and the name had a kind of solid goodness to it that felt right. Thomas, now 7, regarded his new brother with the experienced calm of someone who has already done this once and knows the protocol. Alina, at 6, was immediately and imperiously motherly in a way that made both John and Maude work carefully to contain their amusement. And Samuel, who had no opinions about the arrangements, grew with the same healthy speed as the children before him. The ranch, by 1886, was a different proposition than the one John had built through his 20s. It was larger and more complex, with a full-time cook in the cookhouse and a second foreman assisting Dale, who was now in his mid-40s, and managed the overall operation with the authority of long experience. The accounts were sound and well organized, which John attributed without hesitation to Maude's hand in them over the years. The eastern pasture, the one Cole had wanted for so long, was now one of the most productive sections of the whole property. On a late summer evening in 1886, John Walker stood at the fence of the eastern pasture and watched the last of the day's sun go amber over the grass. And he thought about a September evening 8 years earlier when he had stood in another field behind the barn with a letter in his hand and felt the full weight of an uncertain future. He heard Maude step behind him, the particular quality of her walk on the dry grass that he would know anywhere, and she came and stood beside him at the fence and looked out at the cattle and the evening sky and the long, familiar horizon. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I am the luckiest man in Sumner County," he said. She leaned against his arm. "Only Sumner County. I did not want to overstate the case." She laughed, that full, unguarded laugh that he had first heard from across a yard and had never once gotten tired of. "John Walker," she said, "you are many things, but overstating is not your habit." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood together at the fence of the eastern pasture in the last of the summer light, and the cattle moved in their unhurried way through the grass, and somewhere behind them, the house held 3 children and 8 years of everything they had made together, and the dark came on with its ordinary stars, and it was exactly right. There is a particular kind of happiness that is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with the urgency of crisis or the electricity of novelty. It is the happiness of a good fire in a cold winter, the happiness of a familiar hand in yours, the happiness of waking in the morning, and knowing that the day ahead is full of things that matter to you and people who matter to you and work that is worth the doing. It is quieter than the stories suggest happiness should be, and for that reason people sometimes do not recognize it when they are in the middle of it. They look for the bigger feeling and miss the real one, which is distributed through the ordinary hours like light through glass, present everywhere, noticed only sometimes, and never less than it was because it was not being observed. John Walker had lived long enough and been alone long enough and built enough out of difficult material to recognize this happiness when he found himself in it, and he did not take it for granted, and he did not let it pass unacknowledged. And every day when he rose before the light and walked through his house and began the work of the ranch, he was aware, in some specific and wordless way, of how far everything had traveled from the barn floor where the letter had fallen. Maude knew. She knew in the way she knew everything, by paying attention. She had said to him once, lying in the dark of their bedroom in the late quiet of a November night, that she sometimes thought about the stage from Wichita and the $53 and the carpetbag and the terrifying arithmetic of that particular morning, and how far she had come from it, not in distance but in the essential sense of the word, in every measure that mattered. She had said that she had not known, when she stepped off that stage, that a person could feel as safe as she felt now, and she was not sure she had ever really believed in that kind of safety before she had it. He had held her in the dark and listened to all of it and had not said anything for a long time, and then he had said, "I am glad you got on the stage." "Me too," she had said, "and I am glad Dale placed that advertisement." "So am I," she had said with a warmth in it, "though you need not tell him so with any frequency. He is difficult enough to manage already." Which made him laugh in the dark, quietly, so as not to wake the children, and she had laughed too, and that had been the end of the conversation, though not the end of anything it held. The years of the late 1880s continued in the way of well-lived years, full and varied and grounded in the specific reality of the life they had built. Thomas at 10 was serious and competent, and spent every available hour learning the ranch. Eleanor at 8 had the horses entirely under her authority, and had also developed a strong interest in the accounts, which she watched Maude work on with an attention that made Maude begin to explain the principles to her as she worked, which Thomas would also listen to from the doorway while pretending to be passing through. Samuel at 4 was purely and enthusiastically himself, with a humor that had come from somewhere and a tolerance for the opinions of others that was, John thought, probably his best quality and would serve him well. There was talk throughout this period, as there was throughout the Kansas plains, about the changes coming. The cattle drives that had been the heart of the economy were shifting with the coming of more rail lines, which simplified the shipping of beef and complicated the traditional drives. And the range itself was being fenced with increasing frequency, as homesteaders came in greater numbers, and the open land that cattle had always traveled began to have more boundaries. John had opinions about this that were thoughtful rather than reactionary. He had built a deeded ranch, not a range operation, and while the open range had served the cattle economy well, the truth was that a deeded and fenced land system was more stable, more predictable, and more susceptible to the kind of long-term planning that John believed in. He adapted his operation through the late 1880s with the same practical intelligence he had always brought to its management, and the ranch came through the transitional period in better shape than most. He talked about all of it with Maude in the evenings, because she had become, over the years, his most trusted counsel on every matter that was not purely physical, and she listened with the fullness of attention she brought to everything and asked the questions that pressed on the places he had not yet thought through, and together they made decisions that were better for being made together. This was, John thought on the evenings when he was being most honest with himself, one of the most valuable things in his life. Not the most dramatic or the most obviously visible, but among the most true. The capacity to think alongside another person who was at least as intelligent as you were and more organized than you were, and who had no investment in telling you what you wanted to hear, only in helping you find what was actually accurate. It was a gift of a specific and rare quality, and it had come to him through the improbable pathway of Dale Prout, and a letter he had never written, and a woman who had stepped off a stage with $53 and more honesty in her than most people accumulated in a lifetime. In the fall of 1889, with Thomas 12 and Eleanor 10 and Samuel 7, and the ranch in its best shape ever and the Kansas sky doing its eternal enormous work above the flat plains, Maude told him at the kitchen table that she was expecting once more. He looked at her across the worn and familiar table, this table that had held so many conversations and so much of their life, and he felt the same specific gladness he had felt each time before, unchanged by repetition. "For," she said with a tone that was wry and warm in equal measure, "for," he agreed, "the children will have opinions. They always do. Thomas will be responsible about it," she said. "Eleanor will try to name it immediately. Samuel will ask if it can play." He smiled. "That is exactly right." She looked at him across the table with her amber eyes, the eyes he had first seen in the September light of a Caldwell Street 11 years ago, and she said, "I did not imagine this life when I was younger. I had no framework for it. I thought about being settled and secure and having what was necessary, and those were good things to think about, but I did not have the imagination for this." "What is this?" he asked, wanting to hear her say it. "This is being known," she said. This is being in a place where the people around you know who you actually are and want that specific person and not some other version. This is being home. He reached across the table and took her hand, the right hand that had hit her thumb with the hammer 11 years ago and had held his through everything since. "You are home," he said. "You have been since the first day." She turned her hand in his. "You did not know me on the first day." "No," he said, "but I saw you. I was watching from the moment you came off that stage. Every single thing." He paused. "You did not know I noticed." She looked at him with the small, warm smile that was entirely hers and had been one of the most reliable sources of his happiness for the better part of a decade. "I noticed that you noticed," she said. "I noticed it almost immediately. You are not as subtle as you believe you are, John Walker." He stared at her for a moment, and then he laughed. A real laugh, full and genuine, and she was laughing too. And outside the Kansas fall was coming on with its cool and its color and its long, low golden light. And the children were somewhere in the house making the particular noise of 3 children doing 3 different things with enthusiasm. And the ranch was sound, and the life was real, and the 4th child was coming in the spring. The baby was born in April of 1890, a girl, and they named her Ruth after Dale's wife, which made Ruth herself cry in a way that she would not admit to, and everyone pretended not to notice. Thomas, at 12, was steady and pleased and immediately took on the attitude of a person who has had some experience of this. Eleanor, at 10, had indeed named the baby before she arrived, several different names, and negotiated the final choice with a cheerful persistence that nobody was entirely surprised by. Samuel, at 7, declared that the baby could play when she was ready, and was content with this arrangement. The house had more voices in it than it ever had before, and John Walker, who had once lived alone in it and described the silence as not peaceful, walked through it in the early mornings before the household was fully awake and listened to the breathing life of it. The sounds of children in the deep quiet of early morning and his wife's even breath from the bedroom, and he felt the specific weight of a life well made in his chest, solid and real as the lumber of the house itself. He went out to the porch in those mornings sometimes, and stood in the early dark before the sun had done anything more than lighten the eastern edge of the sky, and he looked out at the land that he had built everything on, the grass and the distant line of the cattle moving and the enormous Kansas sky beginning its daily work, and he thought about all the hidden watching, all the noticing that had never been said until it was said, all the careful, accumulated attention that had been the real architecture of everything. He had watched her from across a field and thought she did not know he noticed. She had known. She had known and waited and let him find his way to saying it. And they had been walking toward each other since the first day, even when they were standing still. And the whole improbable story of it, Dale's unauthorized advertisement and the letter falling to the barn floor and the stage in September dust, and the moment by the porch railing with her hand in his, all of it had a quality of rightness that John Walker, not a sentimental man, was willing to call what it was. It was grace. The particular grace of 2 people who found each other when they needed to be found, and had the sense, and the honesty, and the courage to not let the finding go to waste. He was still standing on the porch when Maude came out in the pre-dawn quiet, the baby on her shoulder in the particular way she carried babies, one hand flat and steady at the small back. She came and stood beside him, and they looked out at the lightning sky together without speaking, the way they had stood at countless dawns and countless fences and countless ordinary mornings that were the real substance of a life. "She is awake early," he said quietly. "She is her mother's daughter," Maude said. "I have never slept past dawn in my life." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, and little Ruth, between them, regarded the lightening sky with the wide, serious eyes of the very new. The sun came up over the flat Kansas horizon in a line of pure gold light that moved across the grass like something alive, and the day began with its ordinary demands and its particular gifts, and John Walker held his wife and his daughter in the morning light of his own land and thought, with the quiet and complete certainty of a man who has arrived at the exact place he was meant to be, that there was nothing more required of life than this, and nothing in this that was less than everything. The cattle moved in the far field, 800 and some head now, the descendants of the original herd he had built from nothing. The house behind them held 3 sleeping children and the evidence of everything that had been made there over 11 years of honest, daily, accumulating life. The accounts were in order. The land was sound. The ranch hands were reliable. Dale and Ruth were in the cottage they had built on the north edge of the property, and their own 2 children were growing in the same Kansas air as John's 4. Everything that had needed to be built was built, and everything that had needed to be said had been said, and the woman standing beside him in the morning light was known to him, and knew him in the deep reciprocal way that is the truest wealth a person can hold. He turned and kissed her temple above the ear in the way that was theirs, quiet and specific and meaning exactly what it had always meant. She turned her face slightly toward him and smiled, eyes still on the horizon. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. And the day came on, wide and full and golden, over the plains of southern Kansas, where John Walker had built a ranch from difficult material and a life from improbable beginnings, and where Maude Keene had arrived with $53 and a carpetbag, and the specific kind of courage that does not announce itself, but simply keeps going, and where 2 people who had each been alone in the wrong kind of quiet had found, in the most ordinary and most extraordinary way, the particular warmth of being home.